Hello, and welcome to this presentation. My name is Lester Hightower. Today I'm going to speak with you for a few minutes about hazard ratios for diabetes complications. I always like to begin these talks by sharing my type 1 diabetes connection, which is my son Andrew. Andrew was diagnosed at the age of 5 in 2010. You can see on the left there a photograph of him in the hospital during his diagnosis. And in the middle and on the right, you can see a fairly recent photo of him taken in November of last year at 16 years old, and you can see how he now towers over me, his dad. So Andrew's journey with type 1 diabetes is shown here, sort of illustrated by A1C, and you can see in the 11 and a half years that we've managed type 1 diabetes in Andrew, sort of the stages of life that we've walked him through. And for this entire time, we have followed the low-carb diabetes management regimen as presented in Dr. Bernstein's Diabetes Solution, which is the book shown on the bottom right there. So this is an important topic to me because I'm the concerned parent of a son with type 1 diabetes. So I want to know the level of blood glucose control that is needed to protect my son's health. And I also want to understand the risks to his health as glucose control worsens, sort of up from normal. It is abundantly clear that leading diabetes organizations recommend glucose targets that are too high to avoid the complications of diabetes, but I have found almost no studies that go down the glucose range all the way into normal levels. And what I want to know is the risk stratification starting at normoglycemia and working up from there. And the study that I'm going to discuss in this talk today did exactly that, which is why it's rare and I consider it important. So the study was published in the American Diabetes Association's Diabetes Care magazine in April of 2020, and it's entitled Impact of Glucose Level on Micro and Macrovascular Disease in the General Population. You can see the study's objective, which was to evaluate whether high glucose levels in the normal glycemic range and higher have a causal effect on risk of a list of diabetes complications that you can read there. So I'm going to jump straight to the conclusions, and then we'll work back and talk a little bit of some details around the paper. But these are the noteworthy conclusions from my perspective. The authors said they found observational and causal associations between elevated glucose level and high risk of retinopathy, peripheral neuropathy, and diabetic nephropathy. Their findings indicate that a high glucose level within the normal range is an important causal risk factor for microvascular disease. Furthermore, the study replicates previous findings showing that a high glucose level, even within the normal range, is a causal risk factor for myocardial infarction, which is heart attack, suggesting that in the general population, elevated glucose levels over time may be important in the development of both micro and macrovascular disease. So this study correlates mean random plasma glucose measurements to various micro and macrovascular diseases. But because HbA1c is the root of so much diabetes management information and research, I would have preferred that the correlation have been between A1C and these complications. But we can work with mean plasma glucose. And so in June of 2020, I wrote an article that reviewed this study, and in my review, I converted the mean plasma glucose measurements from the paper to A1C and then presented those results. So I converted the mean plasma glucose values from the paper into approximate A1C values using the reference chart shown on this slide, which is derived from the widely acclaimed Diabetes Control and Complications trial. And you can see to the left there the correlation between the mean plasma glucose values that were reported in the paper and their corollary A1C values that I converted them to using this chart from the DCCT trial. So here, a quick look at the results in tabular form. So note that the paper's baseline, or a hazard ratio of 1, sat at 86 milligrams per deciliter of mean plasma glucose, which correlates to an A1C of 4.6% from the chart on the previous slide. This table shows the 5 vascular diseases that the study reported on with their relative risk, or their hazard ratio, at 4 A1C levels above the baseline 4.6%. So I highlighted in red, some of the most severe risks. On the top 2 lines there, you see retinopathy, which is eye disease, diabetic nephropathy, which is kidney disease. And as you move up the A1C spectrum, even at 5.7 and 6.5%, you can see how drastically and dramatically the hazard ratios rise. And then the A1C of 9%, very, very, very high. This is the same data shown in graphical form, and you can see a couple things I'll point out to you. So because retinopathy and diabetic nephropathy, which are the first two shown in the legend, because they have such a larger hazard ratio than the other 3, they're actually graphed on the y-axis to the left, and then the other 3 complications are graphed to the right. And you can see the line chart shows, sort of how quickly these hazard ratios pick up as you move across A1C values. This chart goes all the way to an A1C of 9%. This chart cuts the 9% off and stays just at 6.5% to help you sort of visualize, even within ADA guidelines, how the risk of these complications escalate as you start to move up the A1C ladder. And then in closing, to me it seems that patients really should be informed of the hazards, particularly for retinopathy, peripheral neuropathy, and diabetic nephropathy. Because even at A1C values that are well within ADA guidelines, as you can see here, 6.5% and below, those risks are very noteworthy. Unfortunately, I do not believe that is ever done. And I think that's a real shame and a disservice to patients with diabetes, particularly to parents of young children with diabetes. So that's the end of this talk. It was quite a short one, but I hope that it was helpful. Thank you very much for listening.